Good morning. Our guest even commented the weather was so pleasant outside, she was afraid you were all going to be touring the district instead of coming to see us. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone in-house to make sure your cell phones are turned off as we prepare to begin. That is always appreciated. We will, of course, post the program on our Heritage homepage for your future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. History is a particularly favorite subject of mine. As I said when our good friend David McCullough arrived, I thought I would never live to see the day of a rock star historian, so I was very pleased by that. And I'm very grateful to have a special guest with us today who can tell you something about the city in which we live. Most of us pass through the District of Columbia daily and get lost in our routines. Many of us don't even take the time to perhaps look at the Capitol Dome and appreciate what it is as we have a chance to pass by it. Some things, of course, are missing. The Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station, for example. Famous location. Those who know the history of D.C. know that is where President Garfield was shot. We know where Ford Theater is, but you never see anything about the Garfield assassination. That's because you have to go through the west building of the National Gallery to be standing on the ground of that original location. Progressivism hit architecture in the district in the turn of the century as well, and that building was torn down in 1908. You might pass by on 8th H Street, the wonderful little bistro Wok and Roll. If you like Chinese food, that's probably a nice place to stop in. Please make sure you read the plaque on the building. It was Mary Surratt's boarding house. And then, of course, the district can create controversy out of anything. I'm sorry, I don't know if this is in your book, but it's quite interesting to people in the district that Tunlaw spelled backwards is walnut. So they have tried to make a great deal in that aspect of why was Tunlaw named Tunlaw and what's the secret that it's walnut backwards, which is essentially there isn't one, but that's typical of the district too. So I'm very happy to have Alison Fortier visit with us today. She has great experience here in Washington, not only historically, but as a member of the House Committee staff for the Foreign Affairs Committee. She has worked at the State Department. She also served in the National Security Council at the White House, so she knows not only history, but political history. We look forward to her remarks and welcome her to Heritage. Alison, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, John, for that very kind introduction. And obviously, if I do a revision of this book, I need to consult you because I just learned a few things, and you're very knowledgeable about Washington. So those of us who live in Washington are often frustrated by what we see in the city. We see the discord, we see the government shutdowns, we see the inability to get things done. Legislation isn't passed. When legislation is passed, we don't like it. So I think it's useful to step back for a moment and to think about the foundations of Washington, D.C. The subtitle of my book is Designed for Democracy, and that's what I'm going to focus on today, how the city of Washington, D.C. is based on democratic principles and how it has come to its greatest fulfillment in those moments when it has sought to fulfill and to realize those democratic principles. So we had a new country. The Founding Fathers wanted a new capital for the new country. But not surprisingly, perhaps, they couldn't agree on where that new capital would be. And the disagreement over this decision became so extreme that there was some concern that it would break the young country apart. They wanted the capital to be somewhere near the center of the United States, but then they couldn't agree on what was the center of the United States. For the Southerners, they wanted it near the geographic center. For the Northerners, they wanted it near the population center, and that would have placed the capital closer to Philadelphia and New York. So just when things were getting really heated, Thomas Jefferson invited Alexander Hamilton and James Madison to dinner. Alexander Hamilton was then Secretary of the Treasury, and he was a New Yorker. And the northern states wanted the federal assumption of the debt, meaning during the Revolutionary War, the northern states had run up a great deal of debt, while the southern states had not. So the southern states wanted none of this. They wanted individual states to pay off their debt. The southern states wanted the capital closer to where we are today. So in a grand compromise, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison of Virginia decided to package these two decisions into a grand compromise. So the United States government assumed the debt of the states from the Revolutionary War, and the capital would be closer to the place that the southern states wanted. And this compromise was a very important point in the early history of our country and helped solidify the country and helped solidify democracy. So the Constitution, in fact, had talked about a federal district that would serve as the home for the capital. And Washington, D.C. is the only city in the country, the only place in the country created by the Constitution. Article 1 describes the legislative powers. It also describes a federal district that would serve as the capital of the new United States. So with these two facts in hand, Congress passed legislation deciding that George Washington, the father of our country, would be responsible for selecting the exact site that would serve as the capital. Now, George Washington lived just down the river at Mount Vernon. His home was on the Potomac, so it was commonly known at this time that he would pick a location somewhere near Mount Vernon and somewhere on the Potomac River. And in fact, he picked Georgetown, Maryland, as the site of the new capital. Now, the Congress gave Washington not only the authority to pick the location, but they also gave him the authority to select 3 commissioners and an architect to define the new city. It was Andrew Ellicott and Benjamin Banneker who set the outlines of the District of Columbia, 10 miles on each side, from land donated by both Maryland and Virginia. And interestingly enough, Benjamin Banneker was a free black, and he and Andrew Ellicott were very good friends. Now, if you go looking for these boundary stones today, many of which still exist, the ones that are most accessible happen to be in the state of Virginia. One is in Jones Point Park in Alexandria, and 2 others are in parks in Virginia. And if you go to those particular boundary stones, you will see how far into Virginia the District of Columbia once reached. But in 1846, Virginia reclaimed the land that it had donated, and today the District of Columbia is on land strictly donated by the state of Maryland. So George Washington turned to Pierre Longfall to design the city of Washington that would house our federal government institutions. And Pierre Longfall was a Frenchman who had come here in the passion of the Revolutionary War. We had many support from the French. Pierre Longfall was one of them. And Pierre Longfall designed the Longfall Plan. And the Longfall Plan is based on democratic principles. First of all, he selected the highest point that was to be in the city of Washington to serve as the site of the legislative branch. And this was very important. After all, our founding fathers had rebelled against the monarchy of King George III, and what they were trying to establish was the importance of democracy and the power of the people. So the highest elevation was set for the legislative house that became known as the United States Capitol. Then Banneker selected a site right in the heart of the city for the executive mansion, as it was then called. And this was to signify that the president was to live and work in the heart of the people that he was to serve. And to this day, the Executive Mansion, or the White House, as it's been known since the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, is the only executive mansion in the world regularly open to the public. And this is very significant. This is a very important principle of American democracy, that any one of us can go and visit the White House. Go through your member of Congress. It takes a little time, but you can go and visit. It's very open and accessible to the public. So then Longfall also said, and you may have seen that there's been some discussion about this in the Post and local media recently, but Longfall also said there should be no obstructions between the Executive Mansion and the Legislative House. No tall buildings. They were to be able to view each other at all times, keep an eye on each other, our system of checks and balances. And then he also created in his plan a large, broad avenue that would connect the Executive Mansion to the Legislative House. And that was so they could communicate back and forth. You know, in those days, they didn't have cell phones. They had to go back and forth by carriage. So this was intended to ensure clear communication between the two branches of government. It's interesting to note, although the judicial branch, of course, was also created by the Constitution, there was no separate building for the Supreme Court until 1935. The Supreme Court was always housed in the U.S. Capitol, and it was only with the increasing activism of the Supreme Court in the 20th century that it gained its own building, the magnificent building across from the United States Capitol. I'd like to point out one other institution that dates to 1800, and that's the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress is an important part of our democracy because it signifies the recognition of the need to have open access to information. And as we read what goes on around the world, we appreciate that we in this country have open access to information, and this is the abiding principle of the Library of Congress. It was originally housed in the Capitol. It was started with $5,000. They bought books. These burned. Thomas Jefferson sold part of his marvelous collection for the Library of Congress. Many of those also, unfortunately, burned, but they persisted, and the Library of Congress has persisted as a guardian of open access, and it also, of course, maintains our copyright system, which is very, very important. The one way to appreciate or to walk this pattern of the Longfall plan is Freedom Plaza on Pennsylvania Avenue down near the White House has the Longfall plan etched into the surface, also with quotes by Pierre Longfall and others about the importance of democracy. And it's a nice little treat if you're down in that area. Now, Washington, notwithstanding this auspicious start, really didn't amount to much in the first part of the 19th century. And there was a lot of frustration with the city. There was a lot of discussion, well, we should leave this dump. We should move elsewhere. We should go to Philadelphia, which was the temporary capital from 1790. That was the biggest city at the time. It was a very attractive city. In Washington, you had unpaved roads. You had open sewers. You had very little buildings. And you also had slavery. The largest slave trading organization in the United States was based in Washington, D.C. until 1846, when that part of Washington, D.C. was returned to the state of Virginia. You may be aware that international slavery was banned in this country after 1808, but the slave trade was not banned, and it was alive and well in the District of Columbia until 1850, when it was banned as part of the Grand Compromise that agreed which states would be admitted to the Union as slave states and which would be admitted as free states. There were a lot of free blacks in Washington, but there were a lot of slaves as well. And it was really with the Civil War that the debate about whether or not the federal government should keep the capital here in Washington or move elsewhere was finally put to rest. This was when Washington, D.C. began to grow and take on a real identity. First of all, many people came here. Soldiers came here to defend the city. People came here to build fortifications. Until the Civil War, we were largely an unfortified city, as evident in the War of 1812, which had also been one of the issues stimulating people to say, oh, we should move the capital elsewhere, because the British came in August of 1814 and burned the city. In many of our buildings, the White House became uninhabitable, and the Capitol was burned as well. So that was another factor. So they realized with the Civil War they were going to have to fortify the city. It also became a magnet for escaping slaves, and there was a large group of slaves from the southern states who fled to Washington and who lived in what they called contraband camps, and this also swelled the population of the city. And I would say that Washington, D.C. is the place to be if you want to feel the spirit of Abraham Lincoln and what he did for this country in terms of keeping the Union together and then coming to realize that one of the fundamental objectives of the Civil War also had to be emancipation of the slaves. If you go to the White House, there is a very moving, thoughtful portrait of President Lincoln by George Healy in the state dining room. The Lincoln Cottage, and a lot of people, I talk about the Lincoln Cottage a lot because a lot of people are not aware of it. It only opened in 2008. And actually, President Lincoln spent about 1/4 of his presidency in the Lincoln Cottage. It's fairly modest, but it was outside of the center of city. It was away from the White House where people were always bothering him about something, and away from the disease and the heat of downtown Washington, D.C. So he and his family would escape. He would ride back and forth on his horse, sometimes alone, and go to the Lincoln Cottage, high elevation, and he could also walk out and see the dome of the Capitol that was under construction. And it was one of his objectives that the Capitol dome be completed to show the strength of the Union. Sadly, we know today that many of the people who worked on that Capitol dome were slaves. But for Abraham Lincoln, it was also a symbol of the Union. And if you go to the grounds of the Lincoln Cottage today, you can walk and you can see the Capitol dome from there, and it remains a very inspiring sight. Now also, sadly, you can go to the Ford Theater where he was shot, and then you can cross the street and go to the Peterson House where Abraham Lincoln died. You can also, and very recently, you may be aware, there was a commemoration of the Battle of Fort Stevens, where in 1864, President Lincoln went to Fort Stevens as the Confederate forces were approaching Washington. He remains to this day the only American president who has ever deliberately placed himself in the field of fire. And there was live action going on around him. There were some apocryphal stories, not sure the accuracy, but there was definitely risk to his life in going to Fort Stevens, and the remnants of Fort Stevens are well worth a visit today. Now, one of the things, of course, where you can feel the spirit of Abraham Lincoln is the Lincoln Memorial. It wasn't open until 1926, but you can still very much go there and feel who this man is, what he brought to our country, what his ideals and goals were for our country, and they continue to inspire today. And it was during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, as we all know, that in 1863 he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. He also emancipated the slaves of the District of Columbia a year earlier in 1862, because after all, this was a federal district. Federal government had a little more control over it. He wrote much of the Emancipation Proclamation at Lincoln Cottage, and that is part of the tour when you go there. Now, after the Civil War, Washington was the capital of the winning side, and that brought it increasing credibility. There was no more talk of moving the capital elsewhere. Washington, D.C. became solidified as the United States capital. And in this period after the Civil War, there were several people who sought to beautify the city. One, quite a character, Boss Shepherd, who was from Washington, paved the streets, covered the sewers, made many improvements, bankrupted the city, but he did a lot of good for Washington, D.C. And then around the turn of the century, there was the Macmillan Commission, so named because it was chaired by Senator Macmillan. And this effort was part of the City Beautiful movement. And many of the really beautiful buildings, I personally think the Library of Congress is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. Union Station from 1908 compares favorably with any train station anywhere. If any of you have been to Penn Station in New York, you know what I'm talking about. And then there was also a movement of many of the wealthy from around the country saw Washington as a fashionable place. They wanted to come here. So they built many beautiful homes. The social season, wisely, was January and February as opposed to July and August, and this was definitely before air conditioning. But you can today go to DuPont Circle and walk down Massachusetts Avenue. Many of these homes are still in existence. Most are embassies and private clubs. The one that still remains as a home from that period that is open to the public and is free is the Anderson House, which is on Massachusetts Avenue and is a lovely visit. And also after the Civil War, several aspects actually, of Longfall's original plan were fulfilled. One was the mall. The mall was cleaned up, and the Smithsonian Institution began building along the mall. It began, and there was a Smithsonian at first, and it was largely for scientific research. But by the end of the 19th century, the new director decided that the Smithsonian should be open to the public. It shouldn't just be for scientists. It should be for people to come to and appreciate the culture, the art, the science of the United States. And now we have, I believe, 18 Smithsonian institutions in Washington, most of which are on the mall, and we're continuing to build. In 2015, the National Museum of African American History and Culture will open. The Museum of Natural History is the second most attended museum in the world. Only the Louvre in Paris beats us out. And the Air and Space, I believe, is number 3. I mean, these are very, very popular institutions. And also, Longfall had put in his plan these maddening circles that today we have to drive around. But they were meant, circles and parks, to beautify the city and to give the public, the American public, a place to promenade, a place to appreciate. And one of the things in reading this book, although I've lived in Washington for 30 years, that I never realized, they're all named after Civil War heroes. Scott, Thomas, Logan, McPherson, Haynes Point. What am I missing? Just after the other, these were Civil War generals. DuPont, Civil War generals. Seward was Secretary of State. This all came about in the second half of the 19th century. Finally, there was the money and there was the commitment to Washington as the capital to populate these circles and to make them a thing of beauty, most of which are still a thing of beauty today, if you need a little bit of an upgrade. But it was really in the 20th century that Washington became the city that we know and love and appreciate today. And there were several things that happened in the 20th century. Probably all aware that George Washington, when he left office, and again, we celebrate the fact that he left after 2 terms and declined the opportunity to turn his presidency into a new American monarchy. But he gave some good advice. He said, no foreign entanglements. Stay out of it. Focus on business at home. And by and large, for most of the 19th century, that's what Americans did. And even Woodrow Wilson, when he was campaigning for his 2nd term as President of the United States, campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war," meaning World War I. But we did enter the war. We fought for freedom. We entered World War II. We fought against tyranny. And since then, we've been engaged in many other conflicts, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, some of which are very controversial, divided opinion on them, but in most cases, the motivation for them is preserving freedom and democracy and American national security. And Washington, D.C. has become the center and the focal point for national military museums and memorials in the country. And you only have to go to the World War II Memorial and see the World War II veterans who come there and how strongly they feel about coming back to understand what this means to them, what these memorials and the recognition of the fact that they served and so many gave so much to keep us free. I think I'd like to mention, too, one of my favorite memorials that is smaller and less well known, but in some ways I find it quintessentially American. It has a very long name, so I always forget it, so I have to read it. But it is the National Japanese American Memorial to Patriotism during World War II. And it's actually quite close to the Heritage Foundation. It's on the Senate side of the Capitol. And what's striking about this very small memorial, which involves a water feature, cherry blossom trees in the spring, and this beautiful sculpture of 2 cranes entwined, encircled by barbed wire, is that it's a memorial both to the Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. There were 10 large camps across the country, and after Pearl Harbor, there was a very strong reaction and concern about Japanese Americans that they could serve as a 5th column. So there were large camps set up across the country to intern them for the duration of the war. The memorial includes the official United States government apology to the Japanese issued by President Ronald Reagan. The other half of the memorial, and what makes this striking, is it recognizes the service of the 442nd Regiment. This was the most decorated regiment during World War II, and it was comprised of Japanese Americans who served in the European theater. So there they were serving while their brothers, sisters, parents were interned. And I find this to be part of the compromise, part of the recognition that although this is a very flawed country at times, that underlying it all are these democratic principles that hold us together, that inspire others, and that have made Washington known internationally as the capital of the free world. There were other movements in Washington in the 20th century that made this the place to come, the place to be. One of my favorites that I like to talk about is early in the 20th century is the women's suffrage movement. The women started the movement in Chautauqua, New York, but came here and formed organizations here to try to gain the right to vote for women. Now, they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue the day before President Woodrow Wilson's first inauguration. They were jeered, they were shoved, they had things thrown at them. they were arrested, and when they were arrested, they were force-fed, and some of them were sent to insane asylums. Because, of course, if you wanted the right to vote for women, you had to be crazy. So they also, the women suffragettes, were the first to picket the White House, which has become a long-standing tradition in American protests. If there's something you don't like, there's an extensive permitting process today, but you have to go, but you can go and picket the White House, and it was the women suffragettes who started that. Also, the role of government, certainly Heritage is very active in debating what should be the role of government, how large should it be, and this is a very healthy debate, but the role of government has gotten larger. Social Security, there's some beautiful Ben Shahn murals in what is today the Voice of America building. This is open for touring. And many of the departments that were created during the 20th century to address issues across the United States are open for touring. The Department of Interior, beautiful Ansel Adams photographs, other beautiful artifacts. Many people don't realize that you can tour the Treasury building. This is an absolutely beautiful building, the cash room. You can go and see where Andrew Johnson sat after he succeeded Abraham Lincoln, and he was waiting for Mary Todd Lincoln, who did not want to leave the White House. He sat and he could look at the White House. You can tour his office, which is still a working office at Treasury today. Also, the Civil Rights Movement. I think probably the Civil Rights Movement encapsulated the fact that if you have a problem with Washington, you need to come here to make your point about it. And the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, which was timed to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, was a major, major demonstration in Washington that contributed greatly to changing racial relations in this country and leading to greater equality and justice in this country. But there have been many, many other protests, discussions, and Washington is very often the center of those. And very often they end at the Lincoln Memorial. This president who did so much to keep the country together, his memorial has become the meeting point for those who seek change. And I end my book, and I would end my remarks today, with the invitation to each of you, if you have not already done this, but I suspect many of you already have, is to go to the Lincoln Memorial, sit on the steps, look out across the reflecting pool, look down toward the Washington Monument and across to the United States Capitol, and reflect upon what your country means to you. Thank you very much.
In other words, of the 60s, stop and smell the roses in the district for a change.
Right.
We will take questions. Of course, we do have copies of the book available for purchase, and Alison will be glad to sign them and talk with you further up here. But if you have questions, we'd ask for you to wait for the microphone and recognition so that everyone can hear your question. I have one to start with, and we'll go with whoever Andrew finds first. It's interesting that Longfall did not read the Constitution in that we have three branches of government, and he gave prominence to the location of the executive and the legislative, but the judiciary stayed, in a way, under the foot of the legislative.
Right.
Is there any background as to why or what, or was it just a matter of his experience?
I think it partly, I mean, when you go into the U.S. Capitol and see there are two rooms where the Supreme Court sat. They're absolutely beautiful rooms. They're very significant. So I don't think that it was necessarily dismissing the judicial branch, but certainly, and again, there's debate on this in Washington every day, but the activism of the judicial branch has made it a much bigger force in the 20th century. And it was also initially in the 19th century, the Capitol kept expanding to accommodate more senators, more members of Congress, and the judicial branch, but it got to the point where there was no room for them. So I think that's in part.
Questions?
But
from
they
the
were
audience?
with the legislative branch and not down with the executive mansion.
Questions from the audience? Surely. Oh, sorry, can't say. Wait for the microphone, please. C-SPAN will be happy. Thank you.
Are there historic buildings in Washington that are in danger of decaying and being lost?
There are. In fact, there's a very active website where they monitor buildings at risk, neighborhoods at risk. There's a lot of development in Washington. I mean, the good news is the high point of population in Washington was after the terms of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who grew the federal government massively. World War II grew the federal government massively, and Washington grew along with it. And then the population of Washington declined until this last census is the first time the population again grew. But with that has come threats to buildings. Now, what in this book, which is, and I should have explained, it's 12 chapters with a brief narrative at each chapter, and then you go to the sites that illustrate the narrative. We're also fortunate because there were so many buildings that were almost torn down that were at risk, whether it was the Eisenhower Executive Old Office Building, the Patent Office was almost torn down, and fortunately, many of them were saved, but not all of them. And just I think it was yesterday, we have an example of the old post office, which was considered a very ungainly building. I mean, most of Washington government architecture is this kind of, I'm going to blank on it, classic style. And here you have the old post office pavilion, which is Romanesque, and it just sticks out like a sore thumb. So it's been at risk. Now it's becoming a luxury hotel. So it will be preserved, but maybe it would be nice if it could have been preserved as the post office. Another example of that, although I think a good outcome occurred, is the very important Franklin School. Washington in the late 19th century was considered a place of great learning and scientific discovery. Alexander Graham Bell conducted many of his experiments here and was one of the founders of the National Geographic Society. But the Franklin School was a very advanced school, recognized internationally, and it was a homeless shelter. It's been sitting empty for years, and now it is going to be an art space. So the building will be preserved, and Franklin Square is going to be spruced up. It's greatly in need even of grass, frankly. So, but it's something, and I admire these people. They watch it every day. When there are ever raise permits, they put it out on the web, and they're a group of people who live in Washington who are very activist.
Let me go to the back right here in the middle. So you run, and then we'll come to it.
Fantastic talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What would be your recommendation if you could choose just one for best undiscovered DC gem, off the beaten path, off the usual guidebook?
Well, I mentioned a couple, the Japanese Memorial, the Lincoln Cottage. One that I forgot to mention that I would recommend highly to all of you before the summer's over, if you really want to get your patriotic juices flowing, if you go to the Marine War Memorial, commonly known as the Iwo Jima Memorial, and they have concerts on Tuesday night. This year they're on Tuesday nights. They're free. And you go to Arlington Cemetery, which I didn't talk about today, but I can talk about it if anyone's interested. But you go to the visitor center. You have to pay to park, or you take the metro, and they have free buses. They take you up there. You can bring a lawn chair, you can sit on the grass, young and old, if little kids can run around, bring a snack. And the precision drill, where they're throwing rifles that are bayoneted, the music, and then as the lights go down, as dusk occurs, you look toward the memorial with the American flag flowing. It's a real American flag, and you look beyond to the city of Washington, and it just, even now, it gives me goosebumps. So I would, and I hope people know about that. All the military services have wonderful free concerts, and I do have in the book free contribution or entrance fee, and I kept going, it's free. There is so much that is free in this city, so you can go for a little while. One of the, I mentioned the Civil War, so one of my favorite is the Sheridan statue, and one day I've been around Sheridan Circle a million times, and one day I was stuck in traffic. What a surprise. And I looked up, and I thought, that is the most magnificent statue of a horse I've ever seen. And I looked, and it's done by Borglum, who did Mount Rushmore. And then I was in, which I would also highly recommend, in the Museum of American History. There is a wing on American military involvement, military history. And I came around the corner, so I had seen this beautiful statue of General Sheridan on his horse Rienzi, and I came around the corner, and there's Rienzi stuffed in the Smithsonian. And it was just it was wonderful. He's beautiful, just this beautiful black horse, which they say is preserved, but, he's stuffed. So I would say, go see Rienzi.
Down here. Up and out.
I recently moved here from Moscow, which has one of the most beautiful subway systems in the world.
Mm-hmm.
How would you rate Washington's metro system?
Wonderful that it's underground.
So, since I've driven here a lot, I love the metro. I was on the Red Line yesterday, and say what you will, it's clean. I think it functions well. It moves a lot of people. Occasionally they had a tragedy in Moscow recently, and we've had our tragedies here too, but I love the metro. So, and I think it's our right to complain about it. And we want, and I feel sorry for the Blue Line riders, because they're apparently going to be put at a disadvantage by this wonderful new Silver Line, but I ride the Red Line, so I'm happy.
Adam Brickley, I work here at Heritage. One thing I've noticed since moving here is that you get this strange dichotomy, especially expressed by people who grew up here, between the federal city and the quote-unquote real D.C., mm-hmm. or the city that's not part of the federal city. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I've been astounded by is the amount of cultural history you find here, especially with the jazz movement, Duke Ellington and U Street in the 1920s. And another thing I was surprised to learn in the last couple of years was that the U-Line Arena on H Street, which is today an abandoned shell of itself and used as an indoor parking garage, was actually the site of the first Beatles concert in the United States, and has history with the civil rights movement as well. So I was wondering if you have some tips in your book about some of the more culturally significant aspects of the city, in addition to the politically significant ones.
Well, I do, I've been very frustrated by guidebooks where you'll have 10 chapters and then the 11th chapter says, oh, by the way, there's a Black History Trail. So I did make an attempt to integrate the history of African Americans in Washington, because they are an integral part of the city, and from the time of slavery. But there were free blacks here. There were many free blacks in Georgetown. The fact that there was a freedman's village at Arlington Cemetery, Howard University, the Freedmen's Bureau, and also U Street. I mentioned the Howard Theater and the Lincoln Theater. I tried not to include commercial entities. I was very tempted to put Ben's Chili Bowl in, for instance, but I thought if I started down that path, and because all that changes so much, if you walk down 14th Street, every day there's a new restaurant. So I elected not to do that, but because I had Ford's Theater and the Kennedy Center, I wanted to put Lincoln's Theater and Howard Theater in. But I do refer to it. It's not as deep probably as what you might look for, but it's a very vibrant city, increasingly. And I mean, one great place to go for a concert is Sixth and I Synagogue. And I do have some of the churches in Washington, because I wanted to put the National Cathedral in. Well, there's also the AME Church, there's Mount Zion in Georgetown, Sixth and I, a very vibrant religious history, but I touch upon those rather than to go into them deeply. I have a question before we go on, because I want to ask this question here because I know it's a very educated audience, and I've asked this question of other groups where I've spoken. Which president, and I've always stumped the audiences, so I want to see whether I can get the right answer here. Which president pardoned Robert E. Lee? Does anyone know? No, they close. So after the end of the Civil War, Robert E. Lee told his troops, lay down your arms, go home, swear allegiance to the United States, which he did, and he reapplied for United States citizenship. And it was Gerald Ford who pardoned him.
A question right over here. A couple of them.
So I'm 100% on that one.
Hi. So many TV shows and movies center around Washington, D.C. I'd just like to hear your opinion on whether or not this accurately depicts the city and all of its beauty.
So what is it? That Bruce Willis movie that I love, Live Free or Die. And he comes to Washington, D.C. in that movie, and I'm just sitting there going nuts because it's Baltimore. Mm-hmm. And, so I actually
No Way Out is the same.
never, ever watch TV shows that are set in Washington, D.C. And people have told me that my cover looks a lot like the Netflix show House of Cards, which was unintended, but House of Cards is filmed in Baltimore. And so for me, I've lived here for 30 years, and it just bothers me too much. So I watch murders. That's what PBS murder mysteries. That's what I watch. But if it brings in tax dollars, why not? Revenue, why not?
The Washington Monument is off-center between the White House and the Jefferson. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit of the reasoning for that asymmetry.
Well, it was there was an original Washington monument in the Longfall plan, and it looked very different, though. I mean, it had a massive statue. It was to have had a massive statue around the base of horses. And that one was not built. It was the obelisk form that we know today that was very popular in the 19th century, and it was a form that Napoleon had brought back from Egypt when he was campaigning in Egypt. But it actually, if you look at Washington, it was more or less on the perpendicular intersection of a point between the Capitol and the White House. So it's pretty close. There's a map in the center of the book, which is a National Park Service map, and one of the happy discoveries I made was, since this map was done with appropriated U.S. dollars, it has no copyright restrictions, so I was able to use it. But if you look at it, it's pretty close to that point between the Executive Mansion and the Legislative House.
Yeah, I just wondered if you could talk about why Pierre Longfall was dismissed and why he didn't get the building design for the Capitol or the bid for it.
Apparently he was a very difficult man, and he irritated everybody, including the three commissioners, so they dismissed him. And it was actually quite sad, and I do have this in my book, that he was never paid for his work. He repeatedly petitioned to be paid. He wasn't paid, and he died in poverty. He was buried, and I'm not sure exactly where he was buried, but in the 19th century, in a state of remorse, the government had him dug up and moved to Arlington Cemetery. So his gravesite is very close to the Arlington House. And of course, the Arlington House was the home of Robert E. Lee, who vacated it very quickly once he decided not to go with the Union but to go with the Confederacy in his home state of Virginia. The family left suddenly, and the federal government took it over. And since Lee was a slaveholder, they decided to have Freedmen's Village on the grounds of Arlington. And of course, this was also the grounds of Arlington Cemetery. And in the 20th century, I mean, I'm answering way more than your question, but where the Lincoln Memorial was built, and then the Memorial Bridge joins Arlington House, they look at each other in a grand gesture of reconciliation between North and South. This was in 1926. Feelings were still pretty heated then.
We have two, one way back and back, and then Sarah.
Hi. Of the three ports of Washington, Arlington, Bladensburg, and Georgetown, definitely Bladensburg has not changed for a while. It's like a huge industrial site intermixed with historic buildings like Benjamin Stoddard's old house and some of these other places that had been there when large ships could just go up as far as they could, and then that would be where the port was, right? So I was wondering whether you were able to, I mean, I think now is the time to rediscover this, especially now. I guess it's the 200th anniversary of the burning of Washington, which used as its base Bladensburg.
Right.
And
Yeah, I don't have anything on Bladensburg in this book. I mean, I tried to focus on Washington proper. I do have like the Freedom House, and that if you're looking for another relatively undiscovered museum, the Freedom House is located on the site of the Franklin and Armfield slave trading business that was the largest, and it's a very small, but it's a very moving museum. And I believe the story of Solomon Northrop is in there, who's in 12 Years a Slave. And I also have the home of Benjamin Banneker. Well, his home burned, but there's a museum to Benjamin Banneker in near Catonsville. But I don't have Bladensburg. I mean, it was called, when the American defenders of Washington with the British approach, was called the Bladensburg Races because the Americans retreated so fast. But I don't have it. But it's certainly worth exploring. And frankly, one of the History Press, who published my book, is wonderful. It's a regional history publisher, and they do a lot of regional history books. There's one on Silver Spring and the Civil War. So I don't know whether they have one on Bladensburg or not, but they have quite a few books on the area. It would definitely be worth looking at.
So there's the original FDR Memorial outside of the archives, and then there's the new one over on the other side of the tidal basin. And do you know why they built the new one when the old one was what FDR specified, and just why they decided to go ahead and make a new FDR Memorial?
Well, and I think I forgot, there are a few, like I don't have Congressional Cemetery, I forgot Pierce Mill, and the old FDR Memorial, I think I forgot to put that in, but it is still there. There's a lot of controversy now about the Eisenhower Memorial and whether or not he would want a very large memorial. I think it's, frankly, seems to be the trend at the moment. There's been a discussion about Truman. The State Department is named for Harry S. Truman. And there's been a bill introduced in Congress to name Union Station because he needs a building. He needs a building. Well, he has a building, but I don't know. I don't remember exactly. I think I was talking to someone about the Jefferson Memorial, and FDR pushed that memorial, and apparently it's because Jefferson was a Democrat, and there had been this huge memorial to Lincoln, the Republican. So there's a little bit when the State Department was named for Harry Truman, the Executive Office Building was named for Eisenhower, and that's a real mouthful. I try to adhere to that, but it's a real mouthful. So I think he was a 4-term president, and I think you'd probably have to go back and look at which party controlled Congress when it got funded.
Another question, yes, in the back.
From time to time, the L'Enfant plan is disrupted by some tacky office building. How does this happen?
Well, it's true, but even, mentioning the Eisenhower Memorial, and I have not followed all the ups and downs of that, but one of the latest revisions is apparently to take down this huge metal curtain that would have obstructed the clear view of the Capitol from one aspect of Washington. I think also this debate over the limitation on the height of buildings in Washington, which comes from a 1910 act, but in part the inspiration for that was the L'Enfant plan. There still seems to be quite a bit of care taken that if buildings are allowed to be taller than 110 feet, they'll be away from the mall, away from the essential government buildings. But I live in Maryland. If you want to see interesting development, go to Bethesda. It's a mess, but it won't cause any more traffic. So it as we all know, wherever we live, it happens. Some of it, 14th Street development, I read this website every day, and there's a lot of concern. I have children, and I think, how will they ever be able to afford a house in Washington? So you see that. But when I first came to Washington, you weren't sure you wanted to drive up 14th Street, but if you did, it was prostitutes. And certainly going to 14th Street today and sitting outside and eating at a restaurant or going to studio theater is a lot more fun than seeing a parade of prostitutes, as I call it in the book.
Do we have one final question? If not, thank you again, Alison.
Thank you very much.
I had initially thought when you said designed for democracy that it was not designed for traffic. Having now learned that L'Enfant never got paid, he got back at us by his design after all. We do have copies available and hope you will take opportunity to purchase one and come up and talk with Alison a bit further. We thank you again for your attention and see you in the future.
Thank you very much.